Hello everyone, this is Bobbin Threadbare and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. So, whether you consider it an unfair construction or a fact of life, the unavoidable truth is that human society is divided into a variety of classes. There's the upper middle lower division that people are most familiar with, but then there are other divisions that sometimes compound the wealth gap and sometimes complicate the issue by giving one class unique privileges without giving them the most wealth and influence in society. By considering what makes your setting unique and how that uniqueness can interact with class divides, you can create a surprisingly realistic society in what's otherwise a very unrealistic setting. Upper versus lower. The upper class versus lower class divide is the one that most people throughout the world are familiar with, and it's most likely the one divide that human society will never be completely rid of, no matter how much we change in the future. Still, the gap between the upper and lower classes has been wider and narrower at different times and places, and so it can be valuable to understand what can cause these gaps to change. First off, the main factor is limited political interaction. Politics and economics are inextricably linked, and the more a group gets to participate in politics, the more they're able to divide wealth between themselves. On the other hand, a group that has no political standing will have all of their wealth taken from them because they have no power to stop it. The division between classes tends to be smaller in frontier situations, where resources are pretty much there for the taking, and while wealthy people back home can lay claim to regions and resources, they have no real way to enforce these claims. Wealth gaps also tend to shrink in times of widespread war and revolution, but this tends to be less because everyone is able to grab wealth for themselves, and more because all of the wealth is burning. Secular versus ecclesiastic. Priests, shamans, and other religious figures often have a protected status that sets them apart from the usual hierarchies of power. For instance, the Kingdom of France divided its people into 3 estates: the priests, the nobility, and the peasantry. In the modern-day United States, religious organizations enjoy a tax-exempt status, and in some nations, like Iran, the religious authorities are the power behind the throne. The reason religious figures have this special status is because they are essentially the keepers of culture. All of the stories that define a culture, all of the mores and morality that the culture believes in, all of that is remembered and taught by the priests. As such, in many cultures, priests are in charge of education. And back in the day, when job specialization was uncommon, priests would also perform other high education jobs like physical and mental care, record keeping, and music and story writing. Jobs like these, jobs that used to be religious but typically aren't anymore, still receive a significant amount of prestige and respect from the general population, even if they don't always get a lot of money. As such, if you're creating a non-religious society, it might be interesting for them to give one of these professions the level of respect and deference that we expect to be given to religious figures. Imperial versus Provincial. Pretty much any nation big enough to be called an empire is going to have multiple cultures within its borders, and if the central culture gets to participate in politics while all of the others are excluded, that creates a division. While the previous divisions I mentioned are within cultures, this division is between cultures, and since they all belong to the same nation, one culture enjoys certain privileges and rights, both written and unwritten, that are stripped from the provincial cultures. So even if you're a wealthy member of the upper class, if you're also a member of a provincial culture, then in some ways you will still be treated worse than a lower class member of the imperial culture. This sort of power dynamic is very much alive today, although it takes on a few different forms thanks to varying historical circumstances. In the United States, skin color can entitle you to better or worse treatment even if your ancestors had nothing to do with slavery. Immigrants in any nation tend to be treated with more suspicion, even though, on the whole, they tend to be more law-abiding, assuming oppression hasn't pushed them into a corner. Ethnic Jews have been discriminated against for centuries, since they were almost always a minority culture. And so, if you want your stories to say anything about racism, anti-Semitism, or discrimination in general, the imperial versus provincial dynamic is what you need for your setting. Colonial versus native. When one culture comes to a new area and pushes out the locals so that they can take all of the land and resources for themselves, that creates a colonial versus native divide. The dynamic here is similar to the Imperial Provincial divide, but there are a few differences that I at least would say create a distinction. First off is enforced population movement. While imperialists will take the profits that the locals make from working off the land, colonists will take the land itself and force the locals to go somewhere else. Because of that, the territory of the colonial culture expands, while that of other cultures shrinks or disappears. As such, I would also say that this dynamic includes culture erasure situations, where the children of a local culture are forced into being raised as members of the colonial culture. Both of these situations have happened to the Native Americans of the United States, it's happening right now in the western provinces of China, and it's also happened to regional cultures in places like France, the United Kingdom, and Spain. Colonial versus Imperial. In some cases, the colonists from an imperial culture remain physically and socially close to their homeland, and so they all remain unified even if national borders cut their territory into pieces. In other cases, colonists drift away from their homeland and eventually become independent. The dynamic here is interesting because the homeland will want to treat its colonies like provinces to be exploited, but the colonists consider themselves to be the dominant culture in their region, and thus they refuse to take this abuse lying down. And because the colonists have money and resources, colonial rebellions tend to succeed more often than other kinds of rebellion. The United States is obviously the first colonial rebellion that comes to my mind, seeing as I live here, but other colonies that successfully rebelled include Mexico in 1821, Argentina in 1818, Peru in 1824, and Colombia in 1819. The early 19th century was kind of a bad time for Spain. Anyway, this homeland versus colony dynamic is a great fit for settings that involve colonizing new planets and asteroids, whether it's within the solar system or whether it's interstellar. After all, as Star Trek shows have repeatedly said, space is the final frontier. Rural versus urban. There's always been a cultural division between the people who live in cities and the people who live outside of them. City jobs and rural jobs are often very different. The pace of life is faster in a city, the nature of crime is different, and the way you're expected to get along with your neighbors is different. All of these differences create a social divide. But what's interesting about this one is that both sides of the divide consider themselves superior, and both sides kind of have a point. You can make more money in a city, but it costs more to live in a city. Crime rates tend to be higher in a city, but then criminal behavior is often overlooked in rural communities. Diseases spread faster in a city, but then cities usually have better healthcare facilities. And while members of a rural community are more likely to know each other's names, they're also more likely to be intolerant of minority cultures because they don't get the broad exposure you experience when you live in a city. Now, the number of people living in the city versus living in the country can depend on the era and the technology level, but no matter what kind of setting you're creating, this division can factor into it. Old money versus new money. Some families have been prosperous for generations, or even hundreds of years. Other families have made their fortune in more recent years and don't have a lineage worth mentioning. For a lot of people, history and tradition carry significant weight, and the difference in this weight can create a division between new money families and old money families. Members of a prestigious family can more easily get accepted into top-level schools and businesses. They can get loans that would otherwise be too generous, and they can get jobs that they are otherwise unqualified for. By contrast, while new money families are wealthy, possibly much wealthier than old money families, they don't get that same amount of respect, and so they have to work harder or spend more resources to get the same opportunities that old money families can take for granted. Something else worth mentioning about this division is that there has to be a reason why new money families exist. By default, old money families hate the idea of competition, and so they always try to prevent new families from gaining wealth and squash new ideas that could shake up the status quo. As such, new money families can only exist if there are laws in place that create a level playing field, if new opportunities are popping up so fast that the old families can't grab them all, or if some new idea or technology is shaking everything up and spreading too fast for the old families to suppress. Male versus female. Men and women have certain differences in musculature and brain chemistry that make them, or at least the average representative, better suited for different tasks. As the Iron Age took hold, male-suited jobs like warfare took on additional importance, and so men were able to take power from women and create a barrier between them with restrictions on rights, available professions, and gender norms. Over the last 150 years, these restrictions have been falling away, not just because women are getting organized, but also because gunpowder and industrialization have made the male physique less valuable. And while the physical division between males and females will never completely vanish, the social division most certainly can. As a setting creator, you may want to ask yourself whether the sexual divide makes sense for the time period and the different laws of physics that you're using. Something else you should ask is whether that divide would be the same for all of the different races and species of your setting. Maybe you could have a species with 3 sexes, 2 of which are marginalized but for different reasons. Maybe the females of a species tend to be bigger and stronger, and so they marginalized the males when the Iron Age came along. Maybe a species is hermaphroditic, or maybe they have minimal sexual dimorphism, and so there is no gender distinction. Remember, you're writing speculative fiction here, so feel free to speculate. Magical versus non-magical. This division can only exist in a fantasy world, and even then only within very particular kinds of fantasy. For many settings, the division between magic haves and non-magic have-nots is used as a metaphor for one of the other divisions I've described above. For instance, the old magic families of Harry Potter dislike new magic users like Hermione, and this clearly represents the division between old money and new money. In other settings, anyone can use magic so long as they can afford the education, and so it can come to represent the upper class versus lower class division. I've also come across at least one setting where only women are allowed to learn magic and only men are allowed to learn fighting, and so in that case, magic is part of the gender divide. However, I think it's important to note that magic can represent something that none of these other divisions cover. Magic can concentrate an incredible amount of power into a single person's hands, and it does so in a way that real life could never manage. Unlike wealth, magic cannot be seized or stolen. Unlike influence, you don't have to care what other people think, and unlike an army, you don't have to worry about betrayals or incompetent followers. A single magic user can be as powerful as any army or an entire nation, and they would have no one to answer to except themselves. Now obviously all of that is subject to change depending on the rules of your setting, but that's really my whole point. If magic is so powerful and unrestricted in your setting that only a magic user can stop another magic user, then that's going to create an incredible societal divide that doesn't match up with anything we see in the real world. If that's what you're going for, then more power to you, but if you want magic to be a metaphor for a real-life division, then you should make sure it has some strong limitations and restrictions. Castes. Social mobility is the idea that, while there may be a division between social classes, there's at least a chance for someone to move between those classes within their lifetime. A beggar could strike it rich and become a millionaire, the son of a noble could join the church, or a provincial family could adopt the religion and culture of the ruling class and improve its status. However, under a caste system, this mobility is nearly or completely impossible. Whatever you are when you are born is what you will be until you die. India's caste system is the classic example, but while the basis of it is a set of 4 varnas, the actual application of the caste system is incredibly complex and varies a lot depending on where you are in the subcontinent. The Yuan dynasty of China created a caste system, and they based theirs entirely on region of origin. And then in Edo period Japan, there was a caste system based entirely around your family's profession. In the United States, racial divisions have a caste-like element to them, especially back when there were things like skin color tests for voting rights, complete racial segregation, and restrictions on marriage between races. Caste systems tend to develop in societies where the low caste people have no real chance of taking down the high caste people, and they tend to fade away when those low caste people finally do get some power and can at least start to approach some measure of equality. As such, you should keep in mind that an old and stagnant society is going to have some equally old and stagnant class divides. Thank you for joining me again for today's journey into Weaving Worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.